It was just after 3 p.m. on March 22nd, 1999, when a woman burst through the door of a mobile home in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. She was naked, bruised, bleeding from a head wound, and wearing a metal dog collar padlocked around her neck. She'd been running barefoot down a desert road for nearly a mile, and the only words she could manage were, "I'm alive, I'm alive." This is the story of how she got there and who she was running from. In today's episode, we dive into the chilling escape of Cynthia Vigil and the horrifying world it exposed, a soundproof trailer filled with torture devices, known by its owner as the Toy Box. We'll explore the background of David Parker Ray, the man at the center of this nightmare, and his two main accomplices, Cindy Hendy and his daughter, Jessie Ray. We'll look at how Ray operated undetected for decades, luring victims, drugging them, and subjecting them to prolonged, calculated torture. You'll also hear the stories from other survivors who came forward after Cynthia's escape and learn what police discovered hidden in plain sight in a small New Mexico town. This episode contains graphic depictions of sexual violence, physical torture, and psychological abuse. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This content may be particularly distressing for survivors of trauma or abuse. This is Scarlet Tavern.
I wished I believed you guys when you said it was going to be a really, really bad case.
Yeah. David Parker Ray is a massive piece of shit.
This one took me a while to write.
I don't blame you.
I had to take like days worth of breaks.
I remember we will always step in if this is too much, because unfortunately doing this podcast has shown just how messed up humanity can be.
Yeah. So yeah, this is David Parker Ray, aka the Toy Box Killer. And yes, it is Elephant Butte, but I call it Elephant Butte.
Of course you do.
Because who cares about New Mexico?
People from
New Mexico?
Are they really people?
Yes, they're really people. Well, the one person I met was like 87% sure he was real.
I was supposed to be stationed in New Mexico.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You were supposed to go to, what's that base?
Kirtland.
Oh, Kirtland, that's right. The base that's PRP, but not at the same time.
So, before anyone called him the Toy Box Killer, before the soundproof trailer, the torture devices, or the desperate escape that would finally unravel his crimes, David Parker Ray was just another name in a dusty New Mexico town. To neighbors, he was a soft-spoken maintenance worker who kept to himself. To co-workers, he was capable and punctual. And to those who knew him casually, there was little to suggest anything out of the ordinary. That's what made him so dangerous. David Parker Ray was born November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico, a quiet conservative town with a population that hovered around a few thousand. His early years were shaped by neglect, abuse, and deep emotional isolation. After his parents' marriage fracture, David and his younger sister were sent to live with their maternal grandparents. The home was stable on the surface, but the emotional environment was cold, disciplinary, and entirely devoid of affection. David rarely saw his mother again. The most impactful adult in his life was his father, Cecil Ray, though not in the way one might hope. Cecil was a heavy drinker, a transient presence in his children's lives. When he did show up, he didn't bring stories or comfort. He brought bondage pornography. David was still in adolescence when he was first exposed to images of women gagged, restrained, and suffering. These weren't accidental discoveries hidden under a bed or in a friend's magazine stash. His father handed them over like twisted heirlooms.
Jesus.
This exposure wasn't just inappropriate, it was informative. It was formative. Coupled with his chronic social awkwardness, especially around girls, these images became the basis for David's earliest and most persistent sexual fantasies. He didn't just view dominance as arousing, he viewed it as necessary. The idea of mutual pleasure and emotional connection never developed. Instead, his sexuality fused with violence, control, and silence. By high school, Those fantasies had evolved into obsession. He began sketching disturbing imagery: women bound, limbs dislocated, mouths gagged with ropes, sometimes bloodied. His sister once stumbled upon these drawings and, disturbed by what she saw, reported it to a family member. But rather than confront him or seek help, the discoveries brushed off as just drawings, and no one looked deeper. And I will say, so I will never kink shame anybody,
No.
but there's
This is not kink. I'm sorry.
No,
this is
there
this is
is-
depraved.
like, obviously there's bondage kinks and all of that. That's one thing. But deformities, and I mean, it's just like we're watching Preacher when she's talking about her husband burning her with a teapot.
I actually looked into that just a little bit. It turns out it's not a bondage thing. She's just a masochist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's still a kink.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
still in the
Yeah.
designated in the kink community.
I always just thought it had to be like a mutual thing because I
No.
guess
No.
I don't know.
So after graduating, David joined the U.S. Army, where he served as a general mechanic.
There's some pretty messed up guys in the U.S. Army.
Yeah, we know. We're sitting next to one.
Hey, now
I mean,
some even worse people who've joined the Air Force.
Yeah, I mean, we have like a lot of the serial killers we've gone through are all prior service.
Oh yeah, a lot of them are. Yeah, it's
Uh,
kind of sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He wasn't a troublemaker, nor was he notably exceptional. He kept a low profile, just as he always had. The discipline and structure of military life suited his ability to compartmentalize. His darker inclinations didn't disappear, they simply went dormant, waiting for the time and space to evolve. Once honorably discharged, see, this is the difference between him and a lot of the killers.
Yes.
A lot of them, Timothy McVeigh, most of them didn't serve honorably.
They got general discharges or dishonorable.
He is the unique one that served completely honorably, didn't have any issues.
And
Now, of course, he wasn't like the perfect soldier.
Well,
none of us are.
He just went
uh,
under the radar.
he was
He
just
served his time.
he's what we would have called a 9-to-5er. He
Yeah.
just showed up, did his job, and he left. He probably did. I'd probably hazard to guess he never volunteered for anything. He never tried to sort out promotion. If they gave him anything, he was like, "Oh, gee, thanks," and that was the end of it.
I think he only served his like mandatory.
Like
Like
this,
the
that
man-
one
like-
little enlistment.
Yeah, like the 4-year enlistment.
Yeah, back then, the United States has never had a compulsory military service, but back then they always treated an enlistment as like, hey, all boys join up. That's just what you did back then, especially in these rural towns and poorer communities where if you wanted a chance to get out or go somewhere else, this was your best bet of doing it.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's not specified on how long he did serve.
I'm sure we would look that up, but I would hazard
Well, no,
again.
I just Googled
Oh,
it.
you just go.
we would have to request records.
Yeah, I would hazard a guess it was probably just the lowest minimum thing there. Like I said, they
Probably did a 4-year enlistment, if that, because back then you were
they
allowed
could-
to do 2 to 3.
Yeah, they were really lenient back.
You were
in the
allowed to
day.
do 2 to 3. Now it's 4 or 6. But I mean, I believe even then you could even do a year.
Yeah, I know guys in Nam.
They just needed you. But yeah, and there's nothing that states what his rank was either. Honestly, got out as a P1C, maybe
Yeah,
private first class, maybe. Depending, again, it depends on how much time he served.
plus you didn't rank. This was in the 50s. You didn't really look. There's not really anything going on at this point.
Yeah,
You don't really rank up now they rank you up as fast as they can because they
because
don't
they need the leadership.
Well, that and the Army just got really sick and tired of like 40-year-old privates.
Yeah. So once honorably discharged, he returned to New Mexico and took up work as a mechanic and technician for the New Mexico Parks Department. It was the perfect cover. He had access to remote areas, he understood tools, electronics, and machinery, and he was in a position that offered solitude and privacy. No one questioned how he spent his free time. He married several times, though the relationships were distant, some marked by emotional detachment, others by unspoken tensions that were never fully unpacked. Despite fathering two children, Ray was largely unaffectionate, even clinical, in the way he treated people closest to him. Over time, he began to withdraw from family altogether, using his work as an excuse to avoid meaningful contact. But privately, something far more sinister was developing. David began building what he would later call his ultimate project, a trailer, a retrofitted cargo container that would serve as a stage for his fantasies, now no longer content to stay inside his mind. While some people spend their weekends fishing or tinkering with classic cars, David Parker Ray was collecting surgical tools, leather straps, gynecological instruments, and homemade electrical devices. He kept manuals on anatomy, surgical technique, and psychology. He wasn't improvising, he was preparing. And then just for a vision of it, think of like the U-Haul trailers. That's what
Yeah.
this was.
Okay.
It was a retrofitted, basically a U-Haul trailer.
I assumed it was like one of those cargo.
Okay. Like something like a shipping container?
Yeah, that's what I assumed it was. I also didn't want to look too much into
The
pictures and stuff.
I'm sure any pictures it would have been
well,
sanitized.
here's outside.
Okay,
That looks like more like a utility. Yeah, that's like
that's a utility, more like a utility trailer.
But he put like AC into it, all of that stuff. So it even like the inside, it's again, it like Ben said, it's kind of they just show the chair and that kind of stuff. You don't see anything graphic. They've removed all of that stuff. There used to be pictures of the victims and stuff on there, and then of course, as time went on, they got rid of them. So there's evidence that Ray tested his fantasies on willing or semi-willing partners in the beginning, consensual BDSM, that slowly edged into something more predatory. But eventually, consent became irrelevant. His obsession was no longer about role play or fantasy, it was about absolute domination. The most terrifying thing about Ray wasn't just what he did, it was how calmly, how methodically he went about it. He kept notes, not the frenzied scrawling of an unhinged man, but neat, organized records. He logged dates, techniques, and reactions. He wrote outlines on how to induce compliance through a combination of drugs and psychological conditioning. In his journal and later recordings, Ray described women not as people, but as assets, interchangeable, voiceless, disposable. He sometimes referred to them as cargo, a term used with without emotion or remorse. There was nothing impulsive about his violence. It was rehearsed, it was scheduled, it was routine. And there's one thing that I don't know if you talk about it in here, but he had an instructional video that he would play.
I think it's either in this one. This one really more focuses on like before the victims, and that it does touch on some of the victims, but the next one goes into a lot more of what the victims went through.
He would, when he would bring the women in, he had a recording that he played.
That's what I thought.
Instructing that's probably what I found. I'm sure I have it somewhere, but it was instructing them on everything that was going to happen, what to do, blah blah blah. If I can find it, I'll put it in probably the next episode, and so everybody can hear it. But because it's nothing like you don't hear any of the women, it's his instruction. I did find a recording though of him and his girlfriend before, because you can hear her giving orders and stuff like that, which we'll get into her later. So perhaps the most disturbing part of David Parker Ray's background is this: he almost never drew attention to himself. No criminal record, no public outbursts, no paper trail. Just a man in his late 50s living in a small lakeside town, fixing machinery and saying hello to his neighbors. And this is what made him so unique as well. There's no pattern. Typically, when you look at serial killers or criminals of any kind, there's a pattern. There's some kind of, especially with serial killers, you have arson, you have killing of animals, things like that. He had none of that.
So
That's why he got away with it for so long.
So with that video, or with that video that you're talking about, I possibly do talk about it in this episode. I don't remember what I wrote because I tried to blank it all out.
But beneath that quiet exterior was a man who had spent decades crafting a world that would make horror films seem tame. A man who built his identity not from the community around him, but from fantasies that festered in silence for nearly half a century. His public life was a mask. His real life was locked inside a trailer, parked not far from the shores of Elephant Butt Lake. And no one knew until a chained woman in a steel collar ran down a dirt road and changed everything.
I thought we were over that shit already.
For most people, fantasies are fleeting. They pass through the mind like smoke, imaginative, perhaps dark, but ultimately harmless. For David Parker Ray, they were blueprints, and he wasn't content to leave them on paper. By the time he reached his late 40s, the separation between David's internal world and the real one had completely eroded. The ideas that once lived inside sketchbooks and daydreams had begun to take shape in metal and concrete bolts and wires. His fantasies weren't just becoming real, they were becoming engineered. At the center of it all stood an ordinary-looking cargo trailer parked beside his double-wide mobile home in Elephant Butt, New Mexico. From the outside, it was unremarkable, white, weathered, tucked quietly into the edge of his property near the reservoir. But behind its steel-reinforced door was a chamber that would come to be known by investigators, victims, and the world as the Toy Box. Ray spent years building it. Every detail inside that trailer was planned with obsessive precision. This wasn't the erratic den of a man who'd lost control. It was a calculated environment crafted by someone who understood his own compulsions too well. His goal wasn't just to torture, it was to control, to condition, to break. Inside, the trailer felt like a hybrid between a surgical theater and a sadist stage set. It wasn't haphazard. Everything had a place. Restraints hung from the ceiling like meat hooks in a butcher shop. A gynecological chair retrofitted with leg stirrups and arm restraints stood at the center like a throne. Tools were laid out in order, not in drawers or containers, but displayed on pegboards with outlines so that if one was removed, it would be immediately obvious. This was not chaos, it was choreography. Ray didn't just rely on traditional weapons. Many of the devices he used were of his own making, modified, customized, even welded by hand. He built electric torture machines from car batteries and transformers, designed to deliver varying levels of voltage. He repurposed veterinary equipment to inflict pain in places few would imagine. He even engineered mechanisms that allowed him to restrict airflow not to kill, but to bring his victims as close to death as possible before pulling them back. And that was the point. Ray wasn't just a sadist, he was a technician of suffering. He kept manuals inside the trailer, psychological texts, anatomy guides, handbooks for surgical precision. But more unsettling were his handwritten notes. He documented how long a victim screamed, what substances prolonged their consciousness, what restraints caused bruising versus internal tearing. He was testing, tracking, improving. The mirror mounted to the ceiling wasn't for him. It was for them. He wanted his captives to see themselves, to see what they look like reduced to nothing. He believed that humiliation was part of the process, not a byproduct of the abuse, but a necessary ingredient in achieving total psychological dominance. Ray didn't hide the purpose of the space from his victims. In fact, he told them exactly what it was, sometimes with words, sometimes with a tape recorder, sometimes with silence. He wanted them to know there was no confusion about what was happening. no rescue coming, no misunderstanding to cling to. The toy box existed for one reason: to strip a human being of autonomy, identity, and hope, and to do it slowly. In the rear corner of the trailer sat what some investigators would later call the most disturbing feature: a small television monitor connected to a live feed from a mounted camera aimed directly at the gynecological chair. When Ray used the chair, he filmed the process. The monitor allowed victims to see what the lens saw. He turned their pain into a performance and made them the unwilling audience. Besides the electronics, a cabinet held drugs, not the kind meant to kill, but the kind meant to erase. Barbiturates, hypnotics, muscle relaxants. Ray experimented with combinations meant to disorient, confuse, and ultimately leave his victims doubting their own memories. In his journals, he referenced using sodium pentothal and phenobarbital not to sedate, but to alter cognition. His goal was to destroy not just the body, but the ability to remember what had been done to it. That was the edge that set Ray apart from typical offenders. He didn't always want his victims dead. Sometimes he wanted them alive and silent, wandering the streets, unable to say what happened to them, unable to even trust their own minds. For him, that was the perfect crime. Not disappearance, disillusion. In interviews with FBI profilers after his arrest, Ray talked about the trailer like an artist describing the studio. Not with pride exactly, but with ownership. He had built something that no one else had. It wasn't just a torture chamber. It was a complete system, self-contained, self-reinforcing, and until one woman escaped, completely invisible. The name The Toy Box wasn't a nickname given by investigators. It was Ray's own term. One wall of the trailer was a sign that said Satan's Den. Near the door, another labeled it plainly Bondage Room. These weren't meant to frighten victims. They were trophies, declarations of purpose. And if the toy box was his masterpiece, then the life he lived outside of it was his disguise. No one suspected the friendly mechanic with the gravelly voice and the quiet demeanor of hiding one of the most sophisticated torture chambers in American criminal history in his backyard. That was the final piece of the fantasy, the invisibility. Because what Ray had always wanted since the very beginning wasn't just control. It was control without consequences. The power to erase pain, to erase memory, and eventually to erase bodies. The toy box was built to do all three.
It's always the quiet ones, right? Hey, stop looking at me. I'm not quiet. I always talk. It's when I stop talking, everybody seems to get afraid. Stop looking at me. I'm not apologizing for the way I act. I am not a serial killer or a sexual sadist. Thank you very much.
That we know of.
No, I am not.
That's what they thought about David Parker Ray.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, that really, you really nailed it on the head. That is the scary part of it. It's just that he is really much like a chameleon. He could be anybody.
It's what made him so unique. Like I said, if we look at almost every serial killer, there have been signs throughout childhood and early adulthood. For him, there was nothing. He went through school like normal. Yes, he had a shitty childhood, but nobody knew that. He went through school like normal, joined the military, served honorably, got out, worked for the state with no issues, no outbursts, no anger, no nothing.
I mean, I'll use John Wayne Gacy as an example. John Wayne Gacy was a convicted sexual predator before he moved to Chicago. The only difference was that he did it out of state. He did it in Iowa. So back then, if you wanted to learn someone's record, you had to go. Yeah. You had to like, oh, I know. Gacy came from Iowa. You had to go there and
they
find
only
it.
had interstate records. They didn't have national.
Exactly. So Gacy never, until Gacy got caught, as far as I know, obviously we'll cover Gacy somewhere down the line, but
I think next season.
yeah, as far as I know, until he got caught in the state of Illinois, he hadn't done anything. So the Illinois authorities had no reason to suspect him. But then once he got caught, they dug in. They're like, "Oh wait, Gacy's a convicted sex offender, huh?" Gacy's also hires young teenage boys to do his construction jobs, and half of them seem to be disappearing.
Yeah.
There were red flags with Gacy that once you look closely, you saw them.
But with this, there's none.
No.
And even that trailer, he's a maintenance man.
I mean,
listen, in Florida, those trailers are everywhere. Those are maintenance guys have their trailers.
And it's not uncommon for mechanics to have their own stuff, especially back then, to basically do,
and then,
hey, Dave, can I bring my car around and you fix it for me? Sure.
And then to put an AC in it, it's New Mexico. It's hot.
I think they would have been more suspicious if there wasn't an AC.
Yeah.
That probably would have gotten him caught faster.
Like
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. It's that hot there. They would have been like, huh, Dave's working in there, and there's no AC. What's going on there? That is something that's noticed.
Yeah.
But I don't think he had a lot of neighbors.
Probably not, but I'm sure people. He was quiet, but that doesn't mean he's not antisocial. I would think. I hope. So, but yeah, no.
Why, getting worried there?
Listen, just because I just don't want to bother with people. Folks, just to let you all know, people always make jokes about me being some kind of like crazy person because I just don't like people, and I really genuinely don't know where they come from.
You don't like people. You voice it very clear. You don't like people.
Yeah.
I could give you what happened in Charleston.
What, people thought I was a serial killer? Or
no, that you're going to shoot up the base.
Listen, you volunteered to be for the base's active shooter scenario. Suddenly, they think you want to shoot up the place. My God.
You made it very known when I came aboard the flight that you did not like first-term airmen. By sitting on a table, arms crossed until guard mount, not talking to anyone on the flight.
Listen, I always assume first newbies are dumb until proven otherwise.
And you were proven hardcore otherwise.
I know. I just like the fact that I still won one argument. Got that. And then I married the person.
You didn't win the argument, though.
Yes, I did.
No, you didn't.
Don't take this away from me.
Well, I'm taking it away. You didn't win it.
In the long, horrifying story of David Parker Way, two names appear again and again.
Back to the serial killer.
Not as victims, but as participants. One was a woman running from her past. The other was a daughter raised in the heart of her father's darkness. Together, Cindy Hendy and Glenda Jessie Ray didn't just witness Ray's cruelty, they enabled it. They weren't held hostage in his world, they lived in it. When Cindy Hendy arrived in New Mexico in the mid-1990s, she was escaping something, though not in the way most people use the term. She had pending charges in Washington state, including drug possession, theft, and forgery. She'd left behind 3 children and a trail of broken relationships. Friends said she was erratic, impulsive, and often unhinged when she drank. Her flight to truth or consequences wasn't for a fresh start. It was survival, cloaked in desert anonymity.
I still laugh at the history of that town.
Truth or consequences. For those that don't know, there is a real town called Truth or Consequences.
So it goes between Truth or Consequences and Elephant Butte. It's Butte.
It's Butte. Anyway,
it goes between those two towns. I think that they're close together.
They are.
Yeah. Fun little quick fact about Truth or Consequences. It used to be called something else, but there used to be a show in the 1950s called Truth or Consequences, and the host of the show basically did like an open invite or dare to any town in America to change their name to Truth or Consequences, and he would host a show there, do all kinds of stuff, and this little town in New Mexico did, and well, true to his word, he showed up, had a whole week events of showing for hosting the show, and there's just so few people there. I don't think they bother renaming it back.
Paloma Springs.
That was
That's
what it used to be called?
So it was originally known as Paloma Springs, named for the doves, palomas in Spanish, that frequented the region. That's actually where the Mimbres and the Apache were. But yeah, like Ben said, in 1950, Ralph Edwards,
No relation.
host of the NBC radio quiz Truth or Consequences, announced that he would air the program's 10th anniversary episode from the first town that renamed itself after the show. Hot Springs seized the opportunity. So they kind of changed their name to Hot Springs in the 19th century. It was weird. Because they created a springs on a ranch. It was weird, but it was a spa destination.
Mm-hmm.
So Hot Springs seized the opportunity on March 31st, 1950. It officially changed the name to Truth or Consequences, and then the broadcast was performed. It was intended as temporary. However, the residents developed a strong affinity for Edwards, who continued to visit the town annually for the next 50 years during the first weekend of May. These visited evolved into an annual celebration known as Fiesta, featuring parades, beauty contests, everything. So now they just call it TNC. But it is still a spa town. We should go visit Truth and Consequences. So it's supposed to have healing waters, and there's also a museum there, Geronimo Springs Museum.
Yeah.
It talks about like the Native American heritage and stuff. But so at first glance, her pairing with David Parker Ray seemed improbable. He was twice her age and externally reserved, while she was loud, chaotic, and reckless. But behind that mismatch was a shared hunger for domination, for control, and for the thrill that came from pushing limits. Ray found in Hendy something he hadn't experienced with his previous partners. Someone not just willing to accept his fantasies, but eager to participate. Their relationship quickly turned symbiotic. Ray had spent decades crafting a secret world, carefully concealed from public view. Hendy, by contrast, didn't care for discretion. She fed on attention, provocation, and the adrenaline of forbidden behavior. While Ray had structured rituals and carefully controlled method, Hendy brought spontaneity and instability. And in that imbalance, they thrived, like a chemical reaction neither could ignite alone. To Ray, Hendy was more than a companion. She was a gatekeeper, a recruiter. She knew how to manipulate vulnerable women. She knew the language of the street, how to read desperation, how to bait it. And she wasn't afraid to use it. Her role wasn't passive. She didn't just stand by while Ray inflicted torture. She watched. She learned. And in time, she took part. Witnesses later said she laughed during the attacks, that she made taunting remarks. She shocked the victims herself with cattle prods while Ray restrained them. In her own words, shared later in a drunken confession, she called it an adrenaline rush. Hendy wasn't operating under duress. She was feeding a compulsion. And the way I explain this to people, this is Harley Quinn to Joker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Feeding everything.
The only difference is Joker broke Harley and made her. Hendy was already like this.
Correct. And Harley was a good person at first.
Yeah. Didn't she later redeem herself?
Doctor.
Yeah, she was a doctor.
She was a psychologist. But yes, she did. She ended up teaming up with Batman. And once Joker died, she has a mental break when Joker dies because it was the love of her life. And she ends up becoming a good guy and I mean, that's where the Suicide Squad comes in.
Yeah.
And she ends up teaming with Batman. So yet her participation wasn't born from ideology or belief. It was born from chaos, where Ray saw control, Hendy saw release. She wasn't interested in structure. She wanted sensation, pain, panic, power. It didn't matter who it belonged to as long as she could feel it, and Ray gave her a front row seat. But even thrill seekers have limits. Henley's recklessness would eventually be their undoing. She wasn't as careful as Ray. She drank too much, got too loud, left too many traces. On the day Cynthia Vigil escaped, it was Hendy's carelessness, leaving the keys within reach, answering a phone call while a victim was still chained, that cracked the illusion of control Ray had spent decades preserving. It's ironic, in a way, that the most chaotic element in his operation would be what brought it all crashing down. And we'll talk about the escape, but they literally got into a fist fight. Cynthia Vigil and Hendy. Cynthia was able to free herself from the chains, and Hendy saw her and went after her. And so there was a couch in this too, in this trailer. They had like almost like a break area. They would also put the women on the couch for recovery. So there was a couch in there, and Hendy was over by the couch, and Cynthia was able to get herself free and literally like tackled Hendy. And they got into a fight. She ended up hitting Hendy and then able to get out and run. And that's how she got away. Oh, she fucking was a trooper, man.
I don't think I've actually
that was after a few days of torture, I believe.
I think I've actually seen a picture of Hendy. I looked up one.
So
it was a lamp that she used. We'll get more into it.
Oh, okay. So she's not really like
attractive.
Well, no, and she's definitely not. But she also doesn't look like she's like a big physically imposing thing either.
No, she's not. There's another. This was her in trial.
Yeah, stiff wind could probably blow her away.
Yeah, she wasn't anything crazy.
Well, except for her. She's crazy.
This is Cynthia Vigil. This one.
Oh yeah,
that's Cynthia Vigil.
Yeah,
yeah.
She is the beast that survived. And believe she is still alive. She actually has her own website.
Oh.
I believe she's still alive.
She is. She just recently got out of prison, I believe.
Oh.
I think she got out in 2019, 2020 time frame.
I know she has kids and grandchildren now. So, she's actually trying to be a lawyer, if I remember right. So, yeah. Then there's Jessie Ray, David's daughter, a figure far more difficult to understand and perhaps even more tragic. Born into the shadow of a man who compartmentalized evil as easily as changing shirts, Jessie was raised not just by a father with deviant fantasies, but by one who believed those fantasies were justifiable, routine, instructive. Very little is publicly known about Jessie's early years, but there are fragments, pieces that suggest she was exposed to her father's beliefs from a young age. There were no overt signs of abuse, no arrests, no childhood outbursts that made headlines. But silence, in families like this, is its own form of inheritance. Jessie wasn't estranged from her father. Quite the opposite. She stayed close, geographically and emotionally. In some ways, she was his only lasting relationship. That closeness became more unsettling when, in the mid-1980s, Jessie contacted the FBI herself. She told them her father was abducting women, that he had taken some across the border into Mexico, that he was involved in human trafficking. The claims were chilling, but they were vague, unsupported, and easily dismissed. Without physical evidence or known victims, law enforcement chalked it up to family drama. No follow-up, no file, no protection. What drove Jessie to report him and then return to his side remains a haunting question. Was it guilt, fear, a cry for help that was ignored, or was it something more insidious? A test of how far her father could go before someone stopped him. Years later, Jessie would be implicated in at least one abduction, helping lure a woman to Ray's trailer under false pretenses. Her involvement wasn't theoretical, it wasn't accidental, it was active. And when asked about it, she showed no visible remorse. Her defense attorney insisted she denied everything, but the evidence told a story. The saddest part about Jessie Ray's involvement isn't just that she may have helped hurt people, it's that she might have been conditioned from birth to believe it was normal. That control, obedience, and silence were the foundations of loyalty. That women existed to be handled, not heard. In many ways, Jessie and Cindy Hendy were opposites. Hendy was loud, impulsive, and reckless. Jessie was quiet, ingrained, and chillingly compliant. But in David Parker Ray's world, both had roles. One kept things moving, the other kept things clean. Neither of them stopped him, and neither, despite all the damage, truly got away with it. Yeah, so
That's terrible to do that to a child. To just, because you look at it and it's like, oh, poor Jessie, but she's doing this as an adult, so it's like, yeah, she is responsible.
Yeah, but how much of that was trained to her by her father as a young child?
That's where the line is.
Maybe it was she was helping him at a young age, or saw something at a young age, and he blackmailed her, or he forced her into it. Who really knows what happened?
Yeah, I gotta believe it was conditioning. Because look at what his father did to him.
I mean, yeah.
Oftentimes that will happen if you look at abusers. If you look into their own history, it's the exact same thing. Something happened to them and something has broken in their minds that they now must continue it.
So I'll show you these later, but anybody can go on the FBI website and find items and artifacts that were actually collected.
Oh, I saw those.
The jewelry.
Yep.
So all the jewelry that was
Found.
collected, he kept their jewelry.
Well, the FBI did that so then they could try to figure out
who they were,
more victims' names.
Yeah.
And they did find a few more. Unfortunately, we'll never know how many victims he actually had.
Just keep in mind, there's 401 photos. Yeah. So there's a lot here. And this isn't just this stuff. It's also like evidence, but you can go onto the FBI website. If you go into the Albuquerque field office part, it will pull up this investigation. But you can see like clothing,
a 50-cent coin,
all the different clothings and underwear, and there's even a bracelet that says Linda on it, which that's one of the victims we'll talk about. But yeah, so you can go in there and see all of that if you want. It's interesting to see it all, minus the lock of hair. But so by the time Cynthia Vigil fled barefoot into the desert, dragging a chain and a bloodied steel collar behind her, it was already too late for the others. David Parker Ray had been operating in plain sight for decades. And while Cynthia's escape blew open the locked door to his hidden world, it wasn't the beginning of his crimes. It was the breaking point. Before the 911 call, before the search warrant, before the toy box was unsealed, there were whispers. There were women who vanished. There were crimes dismissed as coincidences. But once Ray's name was in the system, investigators began to look backward, and the shadows came alive. Clearest indicator that Ray had been practicing long before Cynthia's abduction came not from a body, but from objects left behind. When agents searched his property, they found more than instruments of torture. They found trophies, rings, earrings, clothing, shoes, like we were talking about. Many of these personal effects were stored in labeled bags, carefully preserved like relics of some twisted collection. Yet no corresponding police reports existed. No missing persons list matched the evidence. The women these items had belonged to had simply vanished. Some of Ray's own writings hinted at what may have happened to them. His private journals spanning years contained detailed entries, physical descriptions of victims, notes on their training process, and unsettling euphemisms like terminated use. There were no names, only initials, dates, and the occasional cryptic notation: too much fight, uncooperative, disposed. The disturbing implication was clear. Cynthia was not his first. She may not have even been his 50th. One such case that rose quickly to the surface was that of a man named Billy Ray Bowers, a former associate of Ray's from Phoenix, Arizona, who vanished in 1988. A year later, his body was discovered at Elephant Butte Lake, wrapped in a blue tarp, shot in the head, and dumped like garbage. No one connected the dots at the time. Bowers had co-owned a car repair shop with Ray and allegedly had a falling out with him over stolen property. For years, the case went cold. Only after Ray's arrest would Hendy later claim that David himself admitted to the killing, even learning from it, slicing the body open to prevent bloating, a method Ray allegedly developed after Bowers' corpse resurfaced too soon. But Bowers was just the first publicly linked thread. There were others, women with no digital footprints, no paper trails, and no one to file a report when they didn't come home. Women who lived transient lives or who operated at the margins of society. Sex workers, addicts, women fleeing violence or living without stable homes. For Ray, these women weren't victims. They were targets of opportunity. He learned to prey on the invisible. Investigators scoured missing persons cases from the Southwest, eventually focusing on Jill Suzanne Troya, a young Asian American woman who disappeared in 1995 after an argument with none other than Jesse Ray. Jill was last seen at a restaurant in Albuquerque, having left a bar with friends before Jesse offered her a ride. The official story was that Jesse dropped her off, but then Jesse's father, David, left town immediately afterward, driving the opposite direction of Elephant Butte. Jill has never been seen again. No remains, no report, just another name swallowed by the desert. And then there was the matter of unreported victims. The one who didn't vanish, but instead were released after their memories had been chemically scrambled. According to Ray's own notes and later testimony from Cindy Hendy, it was common practice to drug women with powerful hypnotics, sodium pentothal, phenobarbital, before dumping them back into the streets. The idea was not just to erase memories, but to undermine credibility. If they did report something, their stories would be fragmented, confused, and disbelieved. And that's exactly what happened. In one chilling instance, a local woman told authorities she had been woken up disoriented and bleeding on the side of the road near the lake. She'd been missing for 2 days, but when she spoke to police, she was dismissed as intoxicated. There were no bruises photographed, no statement taken, just another hysterical woman whose past struggles with drugs made her an unreliable narrator. She wasn't the only one. Reports like these became common after Ray's arrest, women stepping forward, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes in full detail, to describe things that had happened years earlier. Strange RVs, blackout nights, unexplained injuries, and flashes of imagery they couldn't forget. Some remembered the inside of the trailer. Others recalled voices, equipment, or sensations they couldn't explain. A few had only one memory in common: the sound of a man's voice, deep and calm, telling them they would never be believed. Ray didn't just rely on chains and cattle prods, he weaponized anonymity. He knew that if he picked women no one would look for, in places no one wanted to look, he could operate indefinitely. The system worked in his favor. And for decades, it did. After his arrest, hundreds of leads poured in. The FBI launched one of the most comprehensive cross-jurisdictional reviews of missing persons in recent memory. Still, few were ever conclusively tied to Ray. He left behind no graves, no maps, no blood-soaked crime scenes. If bodies existed, they had been buried deep, perhaps underwater, perhaps in remote ravines across state lines. Hendy, under a plea deal, later claimed he had disposed of as many as 14 victims, some dismembered, some weighted and sunk in Elephant Butte Lake. But her statement shifted with time. Her memory was selective, and no human remains had ever been found with forensic certainty. The uncomfortable truth is this: we don't know how many victims came before Cynthia. We probably never will. What we do know is that the signs were there, that the system didn't listen when people tried to report him, that he refined his process over time, growing bolder with each successful abduction. Cynthia's escape was not the beginning of Ray's crimes. It was simply the first time someone survived long enough and clear-headed enough to expose them. Everyone who came before her left no trace. That was exactly how David Parker Ray wanted it. So we're going to get into the Cynthia. That's the one we know the most of, obviously, because she escaped. We get some inklings of other ones just from reports, but because of the drugs, there's no confirmation of if this really happened to these other victims. So
it's crazy.
It is. I mean, I'm just shocked because it seemed like he did some of his victims were from his area. I'm shocked he even did that, mostly because more chances of him. I mean, despite him being quiet, I mean, some of these people did remember bits and pieces. It'd be kind of risky getting caught. I mean, eventually, if someone yells hysterically enough, somebody's going to you would think somebody would get more, like a law enforcement would get more curious to be like, I wonder what's going on here.
Yeah. It began, as these stories so often do, with a life. Cynthia Vigil had survived more than most people twice her age. Raised amid instability and trauma, she learned quickly that safety was something you built yourself, often from broken pieces. By her early 20s, Cynthia was navigating life on the edge of society, trading sex for survival in the streets of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was a life she hadn't wanted, but it was hers, and she clung to it with the same gritty resolve that would later save her life. She had rules, unwritten but firm. Never go with a John who won't show his face. Never enter a vehicle you can't get out of. And most important, never step foot into an RV. They were too isolated and too quiet, too easy to disappear inside. But on March 19th, a day before my 7th birthday, she broke her own rules. She had just finished a short exchange near a local motel when a middle-aged man pulled up in a beige Toyota RV. His voice was calm, his tone casual, like someone used to getting what he wanted. He offered $20 for oral sex. Not unusual, but something about him was off. He was too rehearsed, his words too smooth. Cynthia hesitated, but the moment stretched, and then he said the words that sealed it. I'm with the police. He flashed a badge. It was the kind of moment that freezes time, when everything you know about survival turns in on itself. Cynthia had seen badges before. She'd been harassed, threatened, extorted, but this felt different. The man wasn't yelling. He wasn't even angry. He was calm, patient, almost friendly, and that made it worse. Before she could respond, the passenger door swung open, and another figure emerged from behind the curtain inside the RV. A woman. She was younger than the man, with a cold sharpness in her eyes and a tension in her movements. Her name, though Cynthia didn't know it yet, was Sydney Hendy. Then came the sting, a cattle prod pressed into Cynthia's neck, jolted her body with electricity. Her legs gave out before she could scream. Within seconds, they were on her, binding a wrist, stuffing tape in her mouth, locking a metal collar around her throat. Her head spun as panic and voltage mingled in her bloodstream. She was dragged into the back of the RV. The door slammed shut. The engine started, and the city, the street, the motel, her only witnesses, faded into the background like a dream slipping through her fingers. The ride to Elephant Butte took nearly 3 hours. Inside the RV, the air was close and chemical. Cynthia drifted in and out of consciousness, her wrist burning beneath the restraints. Hendy sat near her, expressionless. Ray drove. The only sounds were the thrum of the tires, the occasional cough from the woman beside her, and the soft click of a cassette player being loaded. Then the tape began. What followed was not music. It wasn't even speech, in the conventional sense. It was a manifesto, scripted, deliberate, and chilling. The man's voice was the same as the one who had cuffed her, but now it was different, colder, stripped of any performance. It spoke directly to her, calling her names, informing her clinically that she was now a captive, that she would be used as a sex slave, that she would experience pain, degradation, and the humiliation beyond imagination, and there would be no rescue. It wasn't a threat, it was a contract. By the time the RV reached its destination, Cynthia's mind was splintered. Every instinct told her to fight, but her body, drugged, bound, and vibrating with fear, couldn't obey. She was taken from the vehicle and led into a mobile home on the edge of Elephant Butte. The sun had already begun to drop behind the mountains. The trailer's door opened to reveal a sterile, dim interior, beige walls, old furniture, and the lingering scent of bleach and rust. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned, structured, and she was stepping into a system. They chained her to a metal pole in the bedroom, a collar still locked tight around her neck. There was a bed beside her, but it wasn't made for sleep. The walls were lined with hooks and straps. A small table held surgical tools. Above the pole, she could just make out a faint outline on the ceiling. A mirror. She realized with a sick drop in her stomach that the entire space had been built for one purpose: to watch her break. Ray and Hendy didn't scream. They didn't yell or curse or rush. Their movements were precise, like doctors prepping for a procedure. They stripped her, cleaned her, and began what would become 3 days of ritualized torture. In those first moments, Cynthia learned something even more terrifying than pain. Her captors weren't enraged. They were indifferent. And that made them infinitely more dangerous. She wasn't the first to be taken. That much was clear. Everything, the collar, the tape, the route, the tools, had been prepared long before she ever stepped into that RV. And if she didn't find a way to outthink them, to outlast them, she would vanish just like the ones who came before. No witnesses, no search, no name. Just another note in a journal, another lock in a drawer, another woman whose absence would go unnoticed except by the man who made her disappear.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she's a prostitute. Nobody cared about her. She just, it's why he chose them, because it's easy to make them disappear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, you know what's crazy too is, have you heard of the serial killer Samuel Little?
Yes.
Yes.
Her mother was murdered by Samuel Little.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh crap.
2 family members, 2 serial killers. She found out in 2020.
Oh my god.
They had reached out to her, but she couldn't even talk. She wanted to talk to Samuel, but he died before she was able to speak to him. She has a whole website, cynthia-vigil.com, and where she talks about everything.
There's another. I'll talk to you guys more off air. I don't want to do anything on here. There's another true crime podcast I listened to that did cover the Samuel Little. It is very
Samuel Little's on our list.
He is, I think they believe as of right now, he's the most prolific serial killer in American history, if not almost the world history.
60 confirmed, 93 suspected.
Good God.
Same type of women.
Murder times 8.
Transient women, drug addicts, prostitutes, across several states. What got him on the radar was a series of murders in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But
he committed murders in
Ohio, Texas, the South, everywhere.
You know where he got arrested, though?
I do not.
Louisville.
Oh,
he was arrested in Louisville.
That's right. He was arrested in Louisville.
Yep. We'll talk about. I mean, he was technically arrested multiple times. He was arrested in Mississippi.
He himself was a transient.
Yes.
So that's why
what made him hard to be caught, because he just bounced around. He was in Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Florida. He killed somebody supposedly in Florida, Georgia, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Cuyahoga County, Ohio, New York, Binghamton.
Yeah, South Central.
So we'll talk about him because he was actually killed 2 people from Cincinnati. Dumped one in Columbus and the other in Kentucky. So we're definitely going to do him next season, because that will honestly probably be about a 4-parter because of how many people he's killed. That's it.
Mm-hmm. I know who Samuel Little is.
So he's brutal. He just died 5 years ago.
Unfortunately, they still never were able to identify most of his victims.
I mean, when there's 60 of them confirmed, 60 confirmed, and even more suspected.
Well, part of the problem is that even Sam Little doesn't really know who they are. They're just people. Unfortunately, they're just women that he came across in his transient travels across the United States.
Yeah. So, and unfortunately, he wasn't put to death.
He just died of old age. By the time they caught up with him, he was old.
Yeah, he died of heart disease. He had heart problems and diabetes and all of that. His girlfriend died of a brain hemorrhage. But anyways. But yes, we will do Samuel Little at some point because it is one of the most, if not the most prolific serial killer in American history. So the human mind is strange in how it adapts to terror. After hours locked in David Parker Ray's trailer, stripped, chained, humiliated, something inside Cynthia Vigil began to change. The panic that had once gripped her like a vice started to recalibrate. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes adjusted. Her mind, battered and fractured, began to scan every inch of her surroundings. She was still terrified, but now she was focused. She had to be. Because there was one truth she couldn't escape. If she didn't find a way out, she would die in that room. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but she had seen it in their eyes, in his especially. David Parker Ray didn't see her as a person. She was a tool, a project, a thing. And once he was done with her, he would erase her. But what he hadn't seen, what he hadn't accounted for, was that Cynthia wasn't a project. She wasn't a statistic, and she wasn't finished. The key to her survival would come not through force, but through strategy. In the moments Ray left the trailer to go to work, Cindy Hendy was left in charge. Hendy, unlike Ray, was impulsive. She drank often, and more importantly, she talked. Cynthia began listening. Every overheard comment, every repeat of routine, every sound from the other room became a clue. Hendy would pace when she was on the phone, often distracted. She left drinks unattended. Once, she even stepped into the other room while leaving something behind on the coffee table. A mistake that wouldn't register immediately, but later it would become the hinge on which everything turned. Ray had left that morning, same as always, with a cold goodbye and an almost bored warning. Don't make any trouble. Hendy was more talkative. She had a phone call to take. Something about a business deal or maybe a party. Cynthia couldn't make out all the words, but she heard the excitement in Hendy's voice. She was distracted, enthusiastic, and vulnerable. And that's when it happened. As Hendy disappeared behind a curtain to take her call, Cynthia caught a glint of metal on the coffee table just beyond the range of her tether. A small ring of keys, likely meaningless to someone who had never stared down their own death, but to her, it was salvation. But the keys were out of reach. She couldn't walk to them. Her ankle was still chained to the bed frame with only a foot of slack, and her arms, though unbound, were weak and shaking. She looked around, eyes darting, until she saw it. A floor lamp with a long, thin pole, weighted at the bottom, narrow enough to push, heavy enough to drag. She kicked it over. It clattered to the floor, a risk in itself, and she held her breath. No footsteps, no response. Hendy was still out of sight. Carefully, silently, she pushed the pole under the table, inching it toward the ring. It caught the edge and slid it a few inches, then again and again. Her hands trembled with adrenaline and exertion, but the keys were moving. One more nudge, and they dropped into her lap. Her fingers shook violently as she tried key after key. The collar first. Click. It opened. Then the chain around her ankle. The lock was sticky. Time dragged. Her hands were slick with sweat. Finally, freedom. But just as she began to pull the chain loose, a shape filled the doorway. Hendy. Her eyes locked on the keys, then on Cynthia, then came the scream. Everything exploded at once. Hendy lunged forward, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy table lamp, and brought it down across Cynthia's skull. The impact was instant. Pain radiated through her forehead and blood blurred her vision. She staggered, fell to one knee, but her hands never let go of the chain. They fought, both screaming, one in desperation, the other in rage. Cynthia, dazed but still loose, had grabbed the only weapon within reach, an ice pick that had fallen from the cluttered nightstand during the scuffle. She didn't hesitate. She swung hard and fast, catching Hendy somewhere near the neck or shoulder. Hendy reeled back, clutching at herself, momentarily stunned. That was all Cynthia needed. She didn't wait for the second blow. She didn't wait for blood. She ran. The door was unlocked, or perhaps she just broke it open. She was barefoot, nearly blind with blood, wearing nothing but the cold weight of steel collar around her neck. The desert sun was low, casting long shadows across the scrub. The earth beneath her was jagged and cruel, but she didn't feel it. All she knew was that she had seconds, maybe less. Behind her, Hendy screamed. Ahead of her, silence. Possibility. She sprinted, arms flailing, feet raw against the gravel and rock. 2 cars passed her, both drivers hesitating, horrified, then speeding away. She couldn't blame them. She must have looked like something out of a nightmare, naked, bruised, soaked in blood, dragging a chain, screaming into the wind. But she didn't stop. She passed trailer after trailer, doors shut, windows dark. No one answered, no one opened, until finally, a home, a light, a door ajar. She didn't knock. She burst inside, collapsing into the arms of a startled woman who had been folding laundry on the couch. The woman didn't flinch. She called 911, wrapped Cynthia in a robe, held her while she shook, listened as she sobbed. I'm alive, she kept saying. I'm alive. And she was. She had survived what others hadn't. She had escaped what had been killed before. And by doing so, she opened the door to a darkness the world had never seen, one that had been hiding in the desert all along.
That must have been something. Just sitting there folding laundry, and then bam, that ran in.
I know she's done an interview. They don't talk about the woman. She wanted to be anonymous, but Cynthia claims, tells that she is the one that saved her life, because she could have just kicked her out or pushed her away, but no. And she didn't just call 911. She literally wrapped her up and held her like this while she's shaking. I mean, comforted her the whole time.
Because she checked other houses. Like, she tried to get people to stop in cars and stuff. And nobody, like, would you stop for something like that?
I like to think I would.
Honestly, would you?
I would.
With thinking that it was a crazy person in the middle of a desert.
I mean, I would have, but
I don't know. And I know that makes me sound bad, but my instinct is, what the fuck? Like, at first, I feel like I'd be driving. I'd be like, okay, this is surreal. Did I actually just see that? I like to think I would have stopped, because I would have at least been like, what the hell is going on? And then, obviously I might have heard the cry for help. And then that's when, like, okay, time to help. No, but that woman who in the trailer was very good for her to comfort Cynthia for this.
So
I guess it's really, really good that she used the ice pick, because if she had just hit Hendy, like just punched her, but still got out of the way, I feel like Hendy would have chased her down. But because she stabbed her and, like, caused her something that probably caused a lot of pain, I think that's probably what saved her life.
Yeah.
Because think about it, this is dusk. Sun's going down. Everybody's probably closing up for the night, being home for dinner. I'm assuming.
It's about 3:00 p.m.
So
the call came in at 3:30.
Probably most people wouldn't even be home. They'd be at work.
Yeah,
so
the call came in at 3:30.
It's very lucky somebody was home, because it would have been very easy for Hendy to just get in her car, chase her down, and grab her. Oh, she didn't have a car.
No. David Parker Ray is the only one that had one. And it was a work vehicle.
Okay. But still, even chasing her down. I mean, realistically, Cynthia's been tortured, drugged, and everything for days. She couldn't have been and I would hazard a guess she was probably not a track star to begin with. So I can't imagine she got far, or she wasn't running as fast as she probably could have.
Yeah, so it wasn't the sound of sirens that broke the silence in Elephant Butte on March 22nd, 1999. It was the sound of a story that didn't make sense, at least not at first. The 911 call came in just after 3:30 p.m. A woman had run into a nearby home, naked, bleeding, and in shock. She was wearing a dog collar. She was hysterical. And she said she'd been kidnapped, held captive in a trailer, tortured for 3 days by a man and a woman she didn't know. On its face, the story sounded unreal, chaotic, even theatrical. But there was something in Cynthia Vigil's voice the dispatchers couldn't ignore. Truth. Not the polished truth of a rehearsed victim, but the raw, trembling kind that's too visceral to fake. She told them everything she could. A mobile home near the reservoir, not far from where she'd run. The names David and Cindy. A trailer, chains, an ice pick, a tape, a chair. It spilled out of her in gasps, fragmented, urgent, and horrifying. At the same time, another call came in. The one from a woman, clearly rattled, possibly injured. It had come from a mobile home near 513 Bass Road. Then the line cut out. Something was happening. When officers arrived at the trailer, they didn't fully know what they were walking into. They expected maybe a domestic disturbance, maybe a squabble between addicts. The town of Elephant Butte didn't have many violent crimes, and certainly nothing that resembled what Cynthia had described. Still, the nature of the call warranted backup. By the time they pulled up, the RV was already rolling out of the driveway. The driver, David Parker Ray. Passenger, Cindy Hendy. the very name Cynthia had whispered between sobs just moments earlier. The officers flagged the vehicle. Ray stopped calmly, no signs of chase or panic. He stepped out with casual indifference of a man who had been pulled over before. When they asked him what was going on, he said little, just that there had been a misunderstanding. His tone was measured, controlled, as if he'd rehearsed this too. Hendy, on the other hand, was visibly shaken, clutching her neck where beneath her coat an ice pick wound was still bleeding. She tried to speak. Her words didn't match Ray's. She claimed Cynthia had attacked her, that they were only trying to help her through a heroin withdrawal. The story didn't track. Not with the bloody collar, not with the bruises, and not with the second 911 call. The officers separated the two and began the process of detainment. Ray remained eerily composed as they patted him down. His demeanor wasn't innocent. It was professional, like someone who'd thought through this possibility, someone who had planned for what to say if the outside world ever came knocking. As they placed both suspects into custody and transported them to the Sierra County Sheriff's Office, a second team secured the trailer. What they found inside didn't just raise eyebrows, it turned stomachs. Even before they reached the now infamous toy box, the signs were there. Broken restraints on the bedpost, a blood-stained lamp that matched Cynthia's head wound, a looped chain on the floor next to a heavily scratched baseboard. There was a woman's clothing in a pile, a stained towel nearby, and hanging above the bed, a mirror. But the real horror was behind the second door, the one that led into the retrofitted cargo trailer. The search warrant wasn't signed yet, but the officers were already calling for backup. Soon, state police, county deputies, and the FBI would converge on the scene. But in that first hour, standing in the dry heat of the New Mexico dust, a small town department realized something monstrous had lived right under their noses, which is why they call the FBI, because, again, they don't deal with crime like this.
No.
Ray and Hendy were charged immediately with kidnapping, sexual assault, and conspiracy. 12 counts to start. It wasn't enough to capture what had happened, but it was a beginning. Bail was set at $1 million each, which again, they can't afford. Hendy doesn't work. She's a drunk. And David Parker Ray works for the state. He can't afford that.
No.
At first, it seemed like a closed case. A man and a woman had abducted someone, the victim escaped, and the evidence was already stacking up. What officers didn't know yet, couldn't know, was that this arrest wasn't the conclusion of a violent crime. It was the unveiling of a hidden world. They weren't holding a couple of sadistic opportunists. They were holding the gatekeepers to a system, one that had operated for decades in silence with precision and unthinkable cruelty. And it had all begun to unravel because one woman had refused to die quietly. It began with the sound of a key turning in a rusted padlock. Even before they stepped inside, the officer could feel it. Something unnatural lingered in the air around that trailer. Not just the stillness of the desert or the heat clinging to the metal walls, but a sense of something profoundly wrong. As if the structure itself had absorbed the screams of its victims and held them within its walls. They had been warned by Cynthia Vigil, but nothing, not the dispatcher's notes, not the injuries she sustained, not even the bloody collar she had fled with, could have prepared them for what lay beyond the thin metal door. What police found inside was not a crime scene, it was a theater. The trailer, a white unmarked cargo unit about the size of a small moving truck, had been transformed into a fully customized chamber of horror. It wasn't messy or chaotic, not the panicked lair of a spree killer or an addict in the throes of rage. It was clean, organized, clinical. Every item had its place. Every surface was meticulously arranged. This wasn't a room for violence. It was a room for performance. At the center sat a gynecological examination chair bolted to the floor. Its vinyl surface was split in places from overuse. Attached stirrups jutted out like cold skeletal arms waiting to hold someone still. Above it, mounted to the ceiling, was a mirror angled downward so that the restrained woman would be forced to watch everything done to her. To the left of the chair, a wall of tools, surgical clamps, metal spreaders, whips, ropes, chains, syringes, and custom devices that defied easy classification. Some were hand-built with parts scavenged from machinery. Others had been modified from veterinary instruments. There were no fingerprints, no stray hairs, no signs of a struggle. Because here there was no struggle, only compliance. On a shelf above the instruments, police found bottles and vials, marked and unmarked, of drugs they would later identify as sodium pentothal, phenobarbital, and ketamine. These weren't simply to sedate, they were to disorient, to erase, to reprogram. Ray had compiled handwritten dosing schedules for captives based on weight, time in captivity, and desired compliance. In the back corner, investigators discovered a stack of videotapes, each labeled only with dates or cryptic initials. When played later, they revealed grainy, handheld footage of women, terrified, restrained, their identities obscured, being tortured while Ray narrated methodically and without hesitation. There was no sense of urgency in his voice, no rage, just a man performing a routine.
Do not envy the law enforcement or the FBI people that had to listen to that.
Yeah. Mounted nearby was a television monitor connected to a video camera aimed squarely at the chair. Ray had created a closed-loop feedback system. His victims saw themselves suffering in real time, captured, displayed, dehumanized. It wasn't enough for him to cause pain. He needed them to witness it, to internalize it, to believe that their suffering was not only inevitable, but deserved. On the opposite wall, police found detailed sketches of women in bondage, some anatomically accurate, others surreal in their sadism. Many were drawn by hand. Some had notes scribbled in the margins, pressure points, pain duration, suggestions for new tools. Others contained psychological profiles of imaginary victims, cold descriptions of how to break a woman's will in stages. Beside the drawing sat a mannequin, dressed in lingerie, its mouth stuffed with cloth and eyes covered in tape. It was posed like a trophy, propped against the wall, surrounded by a halo of Christmas lights. And then there were the dolls.
Oh boy.
Dozens of them. Some child-sized, some adult-shaped, all of them strung up in elaborate bondage displays, arms twisted behind their backs, legs spread and bound, faces gagged. Not one was intact. Not one was undamaged. They were staging scenes across the trailer, hanging from the ceiling or arranged in cages. They weren't decorations. They were rehearsals. In a nearby filing cabinet, officers discovered binders full of notes, procedural documents that read more like military manuals than personal diaries. One was titled Slave Orientation, another Conditioning Through Disorientation and Reward. These weren't fantasy stories. They were instructional and terrifyingly precise. Ray had kept logs on every woman who entered that trailer. Some logs included entries like Stage 1 complete, responds well to threat of electricity, or memory hazy after 48-hour protocol. These weren't written in fits of mania. They were kept like lab records, dated, labeled, and organized by outcome. At the bottom of a metal locker, police uncovered a cassette tape, inserted into an old portable recorder. On it, Ray's voice, calm, measured. He addressed his captives directly with mock politeness and clinical certainty. "You're here because we want you here," he said. "You no longer have control over your body. That belongs to me now." Next to the player was a stack of jewelry, clothing, and identification cards, souvenirs later believed to belong to women who had never reported an assault, or worse, women who had never been found. Outside the trailer, another unit, a small storage box, held chains, collars, and tools soaked in something dry and brown, likely blood. No DNA testing had been done yet, but seasoned officers did need lab results to recognize what they were looking at. Back inside the home, the search continued. In David Parker Ray's bedroom closet, police found a metal tackle box containing used tampons. Another box held locks of hair, each tied with a ribbon. In his nightstand, more videos, more photos, more names. And then there were the signs, literal signs taped to the inside of the trailer door. Satan's Den, bondage room, obey and live. Not graffiti, not decoration, labels, like aisle markers in a supermarket. Except instead of food, these shelves held memories of pain. For seasoned investigators, some with decades of experience, it was unlike anything they had ever seen. One officer, upon leaving the trailer, vomited in the dirt.
Yeah, I'm kind of wanting to do that right now.
Another refused to return a second time. We haven't even gotten into the details yet.
That's
I don't think it goes. I think this is as graphic as it goes, but I'm not 100% sure because, again, I tried to tone this all out.
I don't blame you.
It wasn't just the tools, it was the intention. Every inch of that trailer had been optimized for the deconstruction of a human being. It was ritualized, repeatable, and deliberately invisible. No windows, no noise, no questions from neighbors. And yet it had existed for years, and he had sound panels inside of it, so you couldn't hear a thing.
I know this seems like an odd thing to focus on, but I really would. I wonder if David had a form of obsessive compulsive disorder, because usually this type, that when we see this, it is just that. It's a very chaotic fantasy. It's people who do this aren't very organized, and yet everything about this is right down to the T.
Or he really just took to his military training. You gotta remember, he's military trained.
It could be, but
There's some people that take to that.
I really feel like I would be curious, like in his, like, not his this, but like in his other, like his workstation at home, or how the rest of his living space look. I would not be surprised if he had a form of obsessive compulsive disorder.
I don't think he did have that. I don't think so. He even said, or they even said that he took to military life
very well.
Very well.
It just seems like this is a step further than just a rigid
Not
military discipline.
Necessarily, because think about his childhood; it was all chaotic. Yeah. He joins the military. That finally gives him like a structure to follow. So now he's following that structure because it makes sense to him.
So again, one officer, upon leaving the trailer, vomited in the dirt. Another refused to return a second time. It wasn't just the tools, it was the intention. Every inch of that trailer had been optimized for the deconstruction of a human being. It was ritualized, repeatable, and deliberately invisible. No windows, no noise, no questions from neighbors. And yet it had existed for years. The discovery would send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the Southwest. It would lead to reopened missing persons cases, cross-state searches, and the largest forensic evidence collection operation in New Mexico history at the time. But inside that trailer, inside the toy box, it wasn't about law or justice or evidence. It was about power. It was about domination, not for money or revenge or impulse, but for pleasure, for rehearsal, for craft. David Parker Ray had spent decades building a machine. The police had finally found it. When David Parker Ray was arrested in March of 1999, the headlines were grotesque and cinematic. Woman escapes sex torture chamber. Toy box killer captured. Sex dungeon found in desert. The words were sensational, easy for tabloids to devour. But behind every headline was a ripple effect, invisible and unstoppable. Other women, silent for years, began to stir. Some were watching the news. Others were told by friends or saw the face of a man they recognized. A man who haunted the corners of their memory. Not always with clarity, but with certainty. In those first few weeks after Ray's arrest, the police tip line in Sierra County went from quiet to overwhelmed. Not with gossip or curiosity, but with trauma. Women began calling, hesitantly, anxiously, and eventually relentlessly. They came from Truth or Consequences, from Albuquerque, from Colorado, Texas, and even as far as Arizona. Their voices cracked with nerves or simmered with fury, but the core of their stories held a sickening thread. Each one had met a man like David Parker Ray, and each one had left changed, bruised, broken, and unsure of what had even happened to them. What made these testimonies so difficult wasn't just the passage of time. It was the way their memories had been mangled. Most of these women hadn't simply been tortured. They'd been chemically altered, Drugged with a cocktail of barbiturates and disassociatives, they remembered only fragments. They couldn't give dates or exact locations. What they had were nightmares that felt like memories and bodies that remembered more than their minds did. One of the earliest to come forward was Angelica Montano, a soft spoken woman from the nearby town of Truth or Consequences. She had walked into Ray's home willingly just a month before Cynthia's escape, thinking she was borrowing a box of cake mix. Instead, she said she was held captive for days, chained, shocked, assaulted. When she finally convinced her captors to let her go, they dumped her along the side of the highway like garbage. She went to the police then, told them what had happened, but there was no evidence, no visible injuries, just the words of a woman with a troubled past. The report was filed and forgotten until Cynthia escaped. Angelica returned, this time with the rage of someone who had been dismissed, and the clarity of someone finally being believed. Next came Kelly Garrett, a woman who had vanished for days in 1996, only to reappear at her in-laws' home in a daze, wearing clothes that weren't hers, and unable to explain where she'd been. Her husband had assumed she'd been on a bender. They argued, she left, the marriage collapsed. Now, years later, Kelly was sitting across from investigators identifying items and photographs taken from Ray's trailer. A pair of black cowboy boots, a silver toe ring, a video showing a woman restrained, blindfolded, and marked with a very specific ankle tattoo. It was her. The realization hit her like a second trauma. She had been one of them, not in theory, in fact. Her life for years had been lived in the shadow of a crime she didn't even know had happened. Each woman who came forward faced the same challenge. They weren't just telling their stories, they were building them in real time, filling in blanks, trying to determine which pieces were dreams and which were memories. She had already sought psychiatric care. Others had turned to drugs or alcohol to suppress the flashbacks. Few had tried to end their own lives. None of them had ever been believed until now. One woman from Las Cruces told police about waking up in a van, her wrist bruised, her clothing torn, and a man's voice echoing in her head. Another from El Paso remembered being shown diagrams of the female anatomy and being told she would be educated. She had always thought it was a hallucination. Now she wasn't so sure. There was a pattern, and the pattern was deliberate targeting of the vulnerable. Ray didn't pick strangers at random. He found women on the fringe, homeless, addicted, running from something or someone. Women without advocates, without people to ask questions. Women who, if they vanished, would vanish quietly. And that's what Ray had always counted on. But now their voices were louder than his secrets. Detectives began piecing the cases together, building timelines, matching jewelry and clothing to missing persons. Still, the legal system moved slowly. Some cases had too little evidence. Some victims had too much trauma to testify. And some stories couldn't be verified, not because they weren't true, but because the truth had been chemically shredded. To this day, many of those women are not officially listed as survivors, but in their words and their courage, they carried the weight of dozens who never got the chance to speak. Each testimony was more than an accusation, it was an act of reclamation. They had been dismissed for years as liars, as addicts, as mentally unstable. But in the silence between their words was something stronger than any tape, any photograph, any confession. It was survival. And for the first time in decades, it had a voice. In the end, the truth didn't come in the form of a body. There were no dramatic gravesites uncovered, no weeping reunions, no final moment of justice caught on tape. What emerged from the trailer in Elephant Butte was something far more elusive and far more haunting. It was a portrait of a man who didn't just commit crimes, he designed them. A man who had turned abuse into a vocation, torture into ritual, and domination into a form of spiritual clarity. And perhaps most chilling of all, he didn't act alone. The truth that emerged wasn't just about David Parker Ray. It was about the people who stood by and did nothing. The ones who whispered but never warned. The system that failed to listen. The law enforcement agencies that once took statements and filed them away. the family members who looked the other way, the community that, whether knowingly or not, became the silent backdrop to a serial predator's playground. And yet, for all the pain, for all the devastation, the truth still emerged. It emerged in the strength of women who had every reason to stay quiet and chose to scream instead. It emerged in the long, slow fight to reclaim shattered identities. It emerged in the evidence collected, the survivors who came forward, and the single undeniable fact that this story, once hidden, was now being told. Cynthia Vigil's escape didn't just rescue herself, it cracked open a world that Ray thought would remain buried with him. But make no mistake, this is only the beginning. Because while episode 1 has focused on survival, the next chapter leads us deeper into what David Parker Ray left behind. The failed trials, the plea deals, the suspicious deaths, and the chilling possibility that he may have gotten away with murder. In the next episode, we'll trace the legal chaos that followed Ray's arrest, examine how justice unraveled in the courtroom, and explore the still unanswered question that hangs over every detail. Where are the bodies? Stay with us. The toy box is open, and its echoes haven't stopped. So, we want to thank everybody for visiting the Scarlet Tavern. Please remember to turn in your glasses, push in your seats, and as always, tip the bard. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.